Have you ever felt like no one tells the truth about women? As if everything said is either blind adoration or bitter resentment, with no room for clarity or honesty. Society insists on painting women as pure, caring beings, almost morally superior. But what if that whole image was just a perfectly rehearsed performance? And what if one of the most controversial philosophers in history had already noticed it more than a century ago? Friedrich Nietzsche was never afraid to say what no one wanted to hear. He didn't hate women, but he also didn't fall into the temptation of idealizing them. While other thinkers placed them on a pedestal or ignored them entirely, Nietzsche went beyond the surface. He wanted to understand what was behind the masks, behind the roles that society had imposed on them. Nietzsche didn't believe that the relationship between men and women was built on equality or idealized love. He saw it all as a game of instinct, power, and survival. And the more we observe the world today, the more his vision seems terrifyingly accurate. But don't worry, this isn't a hate speech or a blind praise of men. It's an invitation to look deeper, to face the silent forces that operate within gender dynamics. Nietzsche didn't come to bring comforting answers wrapped in tenderness. He came with a mirror that shows everything without filters. And if you're tired of so many lies, if you really want to see beyond romantic fantasies and understand what's truly at stake, then stay with me. Because once you understand how Nietzsche saw women, you can't look at love, power, or identity the same way again. In Nietzsche's mind, men don't really love women. They love the idea they create of them, a fantasy they construct to feel safe, inspired, even superior. He called this romantic idealization, a dangerous lie. This lie claims that women are always sweet, pure, fragile, and morally superior. But for him, that wasn't admiration. It was self-deception. The ideal woman, according to Nietzsche, isn't a real person, but a character invented by men who don't know how to deal with the complexity of the feminine spirit. Instead of facing that complexity, men transformed women into symbols of virtue, of beauty, of emotional salvation. And by doing that, they stole their autonomy, turning them into secondary characters in their own emotional dramas. Nietzsche considered that cowardice. According to him, men lie to themselves because they can't bear the raw, direct truth about women, that they are instinctive, strategic, and guided by a different kind of power. Not better, not worse, just different. Mysterious, not because they are incomprehensible, but because men prefer not to try to understand them. They prefer to keep the illusion alive instead of facing reality. That mask they call love, Nietzsche said, isn't born from admiration, but from fear. Fear of a woman who is emotionally free, sexually autonomous, who doesn't need to be saved. So men disguise that fear as romanticism and lie to themselves until reality knocks on the door. When the fantasy breaks and the real woman appears, many men feel betrayed, not because she changed, but because the illusion could no longer be sustained. Nietzsche saw that as one of society's greatest lies, that to love a woman, a man must blind himself to who she really is. He never saw women as fragile. On the contrary, he considered them masters of a different kind of strength, a strength that doesn't shout, but whispers. While men's power is shown through status, imposition, or violence, Nietzsche believed that women had developed a more refined, more subtle, but equally effective form of dominance. For most of history, women didn't have access to direct power. They couldn't govern, lead armies, or run institutions. So they adapted. They learned to influence from the shadows through charm, seduction, and emotional intelligence. While men built kingdoms with swords and speeches, women shaped the men who built those kingdoms. Nietzsche realized that women had the gift of guiding without commanding, of winning loyalty without imposing force, of offering protection without demanding it. Their power was relational, psychological, built from a deep awareness of human nature. They knew better than anyone what moved men: desire, ego, pride. And they learned to shape all that without confrontation, not out of malice, but for survival. Nietzsche admired that ability, but also warned, don't underestimate that power, precisely because it's invisible, it's even harder to resist. He believed that women possessed a strategic instinct, the ability to make others act without realizing they were being directed. And for that reason, he didn't see them as victims of history, but as silent strategists operating within it. None of this was flattery. It was a slap in the face to the naive beliefs of his time. Society saw women as passive, dependent. Nietzsche saw them as calculating, intuitive, and extremely aware of the impact they created. And he didn't blame them for it. He simply said out loud what few dared to acknowledge, that in human relationships, the one who truly has the power almost never needs to raise their voice. Nietzsche believed that human beings aren't moved by truth, but by appearances. And in women, he saw that awareness elevated to the level of art, not out of superficiality, but out of necessity. He didn't see attention to appearance as something empty or shallow. For him, it was strategy. In a world that always denied women direct power, they learned to master the field of perception. Beauty, delicacy, social intelligence, none of that were ornaments. They were tools, survival tools in a society where female value was constantly tied to how they were seen. And if controlling perception means controlling the outcome, then mastering appearance became, in practice, mastering the whole game. While many called it vanity or simple feminine charm, Nietzsche saw it as something much deeper, a refined, instinctive reading of human nature. He said women had a symbolic, almost intuitive perception. They didn't cling to raw reality, but to how people wanted that reality to be. That's why they instinctively knew that no one falls in love with what's real, but with what seems safe, beautiful, desirable. By shaping how they were perceived, they weren't just reacting to the world, they were shaping it. And that's where Nietzsche dug even deeper. For him, truth in human relationships is never simple, because in a world where appearances matter more than reality, the will to appear becomes as or even more powerful than the will to be. Women, living on the margins of institutional power for centuries, ended up refining that talent, dominating the surface. Nietzsche saw that as a kind of silent genius, a mastery few recognize, but that controls almost everything beneath it. He didn't call it falseness, not at all. He admired that ability to navigate a hostile world where survival didn't require weapons, but disguise, presence, performance. While many men confused appearance with essence, Nietzsche saw that women distinguished those two things with surgical clarity. They knew the mask wasn't the face, but they also knew the mask mattered a lot. For Nietzsche, the way women present themselves to the world isn't just vanity, it's a strategic move. Grace, charm, gentleness, intuition, none of it is mere adornment. It's shield, it's sword. They are ways of acting within a game they were always at a disadvantage in. He saw that social sensitivity, that command of the symbolic, as something born of centuries of exclusion. Women learned to play emotional chess on a board that was never fair, and for him, that had less to do with femininity and more with survival. An instinct sharpened not to deceive, but to avoid being devoured by a system that always pushed them into the background. Nietzsche also saw that this silent force came wrapped in virtue, and that's where he touched on something delicate. He believed that female morality wasn't neutral, universal, or divine. It was an adaptation, a mechanism created to secure space, protection, and influence in a world that had handed brute power to men. Women, then, learned to transform patience, humility, and sacrifice into admired virtues and created a narrative where their vulnerability was their greatness. Not because that was essentially true, but because it was strategically effective. He didn't see that as a lie. He saw it as intelligence, a form of soft subversion, a way to bend structures without confronting them directly. Nietzsche believed that women had learned to moralize their own weakness, not to fake superiority, but to survive with dignity. In doing so, they created a hidden strength within an image of sweetness. And society, desperate to maintain some sense of order, accepted that performance as if it were nature, as if it were purity. But for Nietzsche, behind all that theater was instinct, instinct for preservation, instinct for control. And when women spoke of justice, he heard calculation. When they appealed to morality, he saw strategy, not out of malice, but out of necessity. Moral posture, according to him, was never neutral. It was a performance. It was a weapon, especially for women shaped by centuries of dependence. Nietzsche believed they learned to fight with silence, with emotion, with values, a morality that disarmed others without ever showing the blade. And all of that didn't scare him. It fascinated him, because he saw not submission, but resistance disguised. Nietzsche lived in a time when women were expected to be passive, obedient, confined to domestic roles. Yet even then, he saw the storm coming. He saw the first signs of change. Women beginning to question, to challenge, to go beyond the roles history had assigned them. And he wasn't surprised. He was unsettled, because he believed women's strength had always been underestimated, not because it was invisible, but because it was veiled. Their power was subtle, indirect, wrapped in softness. But what happens when that power is no longer hidden? What happens when women no longer need men to protect them, validate them, or define them? Nietzsche feared that the emergence of the independent woman would shake the very foundations of society, not because he thought women were incapable, but because he believed most men weren't ready. The average man, raised to feel superior by default, would feel deeply threatened by a woman who no longer needed his strength, his income, or his approval. And that threat wouldn't manifest as respect. It would show as resentment. This wasn't misogyny. It was foresight. Nietzsche knew that a woman freed from dependency becomes a force of nature, no longer confined to emotional manipulation or moral superiority. She becomes direct, assertive, unapologetic. She becomes someone who defines herself. And that kind of woman, Nietzsche believed, terrified a world built on comforting illusions. He didn't write about women to insult them. He did it to tear off the illusions, because to him, truth was sacred, even when it hurt. But what many misunderstand is that his philosophy wasn't rooted in resentment. It was rooted in clarity. And in that clarity, Nietzsche saw a possibility, one that went beyond the endless games of dependency, control, and denial. He saw the opportunity for something greater. Nietzsche believed that most relationships between men and women were built on mutual illusions, each projecting fantasies, each hiding weaknesses, each trying to win a game without even admitting they were playing. But what happens when both drop the masks? What happens when the man no longer idealizes and the woman no longer manipulates? When neither seeks to control through charm or dominance, but instead meet each other with full awareness of who they are and what they represent? That possibility, Nietzsche said, was rare, but not impossible. It required the death of sentimentality, the rejection of inherited roles, and the courage to face each other, not as saviors or enemies, but as equals in power, equals in darkness, and equals in potential. Not equal in everything, but equally human, equally fallible, equally capable of transcendence. And to reach that point, resentment must be let go. The man must leave behind his bitterness toward the woman who no longer needs him, and the woman, her anger toward the man who once confined her. Only then can something deeper emerge, not a romantic reconciliation of the sexes, but a total redefinition of what it means to connect. Nietzsche didn't promise this would be easy. He knew that most would never reach that place, but he also knew that a few would, those willing to trade comfort for truth, fantasy for reality. And among those few, a new kind of relationship could emerge, one not based on illusion or fear, but on shared strength, not on domination, but on mutual becoming. If you've made it to the end of this video, it's because something in you recognized the truth behind the words. And I want to thank you, truly, for staying until now. Because watching to the end isn't just about time. It's about courage. Courage to face topics most would rather avoid. Courage to look at human relationships with clearer, more sincere, and maybe a little more restless eyes. You know, when I started writing this script, I imagined someone on the other side of the screen who already felt that the world of appearances doesn't explain everything. Someone who, like Nietzsche, wonders what lies behind the smiles, the gestures, those patterns that seem eternal but are crumbling before our very eyes. And now that you've made it here, I know that person is you. And before you go, let me tell you something quick. I grew up believing love was like in the movies, harmonious, magical, destined. But it was only after many frustrations that I understood true love begins when we take off the mask. And that's exactly what I try to do here in every video. Create a space to talk about feelings, power, identity, with depth and without fear. So if you also feel you need more conversations like this, more truth, more philosophy, more mind-bending provocations that make your heart beat differently, I'm glad you stayed. And maybe, just maybe, the greatest act of love isn't to idealize the other or to try to change them, but to look at them with complete honesty and still choose to stay. That's what Nietzsche tried to teach us with all his harshness, that only by going through discomfort, only by facing the truths that hurt, can we build something real. That true love doesn't come from perfection, but from the courage to see ourselves as we truly are, dark, brilliant, contradictory, and still choose to meet each other there. Because when we stop pretending, when we let go of inherited stories and learned masks, something different begins to emerge, something powerful, a connection with no need to dominate or to depend, where there is no game, only presence. And maybe, if we're brave enough, we can create that new kind of relationship Nietzsche hinted at without fully naming, a relationship between free, conscious, and awakened human beings. Thank you for making it this far. Thank you for watching with an open heart. And most of all, thank you for daring to think differently. See you soon.